Welcome to this presentation covering the second half of Unit 1. This presentation covers from the development of the Constitution in 1787 through the presidency of Andrew Jackson in 1837, so about a 50-year period. When we left off at the end of our previous presentation, the 13 colonies were joined under the government of the Articles of Confederation, which created a national government too weak to solve the economic and political problems of the new nation. So in 1787, 55 men from the 13 colonies met together here in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. Now, they were sent by their states to revise the Articles of Confederation to make it work better. But they quickly decided that the Articles of Confederation could not be saved, and therefore threw it out and decided to write something new. And two men at that convention had pivotal roles in the ultimate success of the Constitution that was written there. I trust you recognize the father of our country, George Washington. This, of course, is after his leading generalship in the Revolution. He had been retired at Mount Vernon, and he was called back to be the chairman of the Constitutional Convention. He did not take part in the debates, but he ran the meetings and recognized the speakers. And his presence there lent legitimacy to the effort of writing the Constitution. If one man deserves the majority of the credit for the way the government was designed in the Constitution, it would be James Madison of Virginia. Many history books call him the father of the Constitution because he was a student of government and he knew how to design a more powerful central government, but one that was restrained and could still protect the liberty of the people. Largely behind Madison's ideas, the new Constitution is going to set up a government with three branches: a Congress, a presidency, and a Supreme Court. Remember, the Articles of Confederation only had one branch, a Congress. And the way to protect the people's liberty from a stronger national government was to have checks and balances among the three branches of government, meaning each branch has the power to block or check the powers of the other branches. In addition, in order to get the opponents to accept this new, more powerful national government, James Madison agreed that after the Constitution was approved, the first Congress would pass a Bill of Rights, 10 amendments added to the Constitution, which would define the liberties of the people, which the new national government could not take away. We're going to go back in time briefly and temporarily here to talk about two documents authored by famous Virginians, which not only had a great impact in Virginia, but in the United States as a whole. In 1776, George Mason, yes, that George Mason, authored the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which applied to the people of the new state of Virginia as the Revolutionary War is going on. And these rights listed in this document included freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, etc. A list of the rights of the people that government cannot take away. The following year, Thomas Jefferson, who of course authored the Declaration of Independence, wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which argued that government should not have the power to tell people how to practice their faith. And this idea of freedom of religion also is very important. And like the rights in George Mason's Declaration of Rights, these become part of, in fact, most of, the Bill of Rights to the Constitution. When James Madison in 1789 looks to write the Bill of Rights, he goes back to these two documents and borrows the list of freedoms and rights that came from George Mason and Thomas Jefferson. Now let's jump ahead and look at the product of the Constitutional Convention and look at some of the compromises that the delegates there had to make in order to create our new system of government. This here on the left is the preamble to the Constitution. In other words, it's the introduction, which lists the goals of this new form of government: establishing justice, ensuring domestic tranquility, meaning peace, providing for the common defense, etc. Okay? And of course, the first three words of the Constitution are "we the people." The people create the Constitution, but not the states. Now, one of the crucial issues at the convention, which brought about much argument among the delegates, was how many members of Congress is each state going to get? And delegates from both Virginia and New Jersey had different ways to answer that question. Both of them agreed that a new, stronger national government was needed with three branches and checks and balances. But the people from Virginia, including James Madison, said there should be two houses in Congress and that the number of representatives in Congress should be based on population. Well, the people from New Jersey said, hey, wait a second. If we do that, then the big states like Virginia will have all of the power in Congress, and the small states like New Jersey won't get their say. So the New Jersey plan argued for only one house of Congress, unicameral, and where every state has one vote. Every state has an equal say. That's the way things were done under the Articles of Confederation. Well, neither proposal got enough votes to pass, so a gentleman from Connecticut named Roger Sherman made a proposal which turns out to be called, in our history books, the Great Compromise. And the Great Compromise is a combination of the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. It creates two houses of Congress, one of them called the House of Representatives, where representation is based on population. That's what Virginia had argued for. And a Senate where each state has two senators, thus protecting the power of the small states. That's what New Jersey had argued. And this, of course, explains the Congress that we have today. We have a House of Representatives and we have a Senate. In the House, the big states have a lot more congressmen. The small states have very few. But in the U.S. Senate, all 50 states have two senators. Now, with a House of Representatives created based on population, the government now has to count the population every 10 years. So that introduced a very interesting question. Are we going to count the slaves in the population for determining how many congressmen each state gets? In the South, which by this time held by far most of the slaves, they of course wanted the slaves to be counted because that would give them more power in Congress. Many people in the North, however, said, hey, wait a minute, you don't treat your slaves like people, so why should you count them as people? And they said they shouldn't be counted. So that there actually was a compromise on this. And this is called the 3/5 compromise, because the deal was each slave would count as 3/5 of a person. In other words, 5 slaves would count as 3 whites. Okay? Now, I know this is kind of strange, but this was originally in the Constitution. The Constitution accepted the institution of slavery by having slaves counted as 3/5 of a person. And of course, that is not going to change until after the Civil War, when the slaves are freed. Now, we're going to jump ahead about 15 years. The United States has begun its life under the Constitution. And our third president, as you may know, was Thomas Jefferson. And along, of course, with writing the Declaration of Independence a generation earlier, Jefferson is most known in the history books for buying a piece of land from the French. And as you may know, this is called the Louisiana Purchase. You need to be sure you can recognize this territory on a map. Notice that the Louisiana Purchase is everything west of the Mississippi River here and east of the Rocky Mountains. It's almost precisely the center of what's now the United States. And of course, after purchasing this large area from the French, Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark on a trip to explore what land we had just purchased. And the red line on the map, of course, shows the journey and the return of Lewis and Clark. And actually, they went even farther than the property that we had just bought. They went all the way to the Pacific Ocean before they decided to return. Now, of course, the Louisiana Purchase is a major step forward in American history because the Louisiana Purchase makes sure that we can expand to the west. Okay? Now, of course, there's Native American tribes out west that we're going to come into conflict with, but this doubled the size of the United States of America. And the story of American history in much of the 1800s, especially in the first half of that century, is the story of the American people settling the Louisiana Purchase. Now, Napoleon, Emperor of France, sold Louisiana to the United States during his wars with the rest of Europe, including the British. And that conflict is going to drag the United States in 1812, okay? Imaginatively referred to in your history books as the War of 1812. The United States wanted to stay out of that war and wanted to peacefully trade with both sides. But both sides, especially the British, would not let us do that. So let's briefly review here the causes and the results of the War of 1812, as listed here over on the left. One thing the British were doing was they were stopping American Navy ships in the Atlantic and stealing our sailors, claiming that they were men who had deserted from the British Navy. Now, sure enough, some of them had, but some of them had not and were genuinely American members of the Navy. So this was very embarrassing for us because we didn't have much of a Navy and the British Navy was very powerful and they were the bully and they took what they wanted, and we felt this was something that should get us to seek revenge on them on the battlefield. Also, out on the western frontier, in places like the Michigan, Indiana, Illinois territories, the British were selling weapons to the Native American tribes who were then attacking American Western settlers. And of course, this made us very angry as well. This was a generation after the Revolution. The British are supposed to be, leaving us alone in our own territory. So President Madison decided to ask Congress to declare war on the British. And that was not very smart. We did not have a big military. We were very lucky that we didn't lose. On the battlefield, the War of 1812 was essentially a draw. However, the results of that war were crucial for the future, and I listed two down here. First of all, we got a new sense of national pride from quote-unquote victory in this war. Some people at the time and in our textbooks today have called this the Second American Revolution, and this increased our sense of nationalism as Americans because we stood up to the powerful British. Just as important, because we could not trade with Europe during the war because the British had blockaded us, this gave birth to the Industrial Revolution. The first factories in the United States were born here in Massachusetts and elsewhere in New England. Since we couldn't buy manufactured products from Europe, we had to make them, for example, clothing for ourselves. So this is the development of industrialization in this country, born out of the War of 1812. Now, let us jump ahead about a decade and turn our attention to a defining moment in the history of the United States' relations with the rest of the world. In 1823, President James Monroe sent a message to the European powers, the British, the French, the Spanish, etc. And here's what he said in that message. He warned the European nations to stay out of Latin America. Over the previous couple decades, Spain and Portugal lost their colonies in the Americas. Those colonies declared their independence and became new nations, countries like, for example, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina. And we believed that our neighbors in Latin America, here in the Western Hemisphere, should be allowed to develop, hopefully democratically, on their own, and that the period of colonization by the Europeans in the Americas was over. So we announced that to the Europeans. We said, don't come over here in our backyard and make colonies anymore, okay? Because this is our part of the world, and we want to be, democratic, and we're different from you, and we're going to be the leaders of the Western Hemisphere. Now, on the other side of the equation, we also said in the Monroe Doctrine that we're going to stay out of European affairs militarily and politically. Okay? We're not going to get involved in European wars. Now, President George Washington had said the same thing a generation earlier when he was president. And President Monroe is going to say that again. Okay? We don't have a big military. We don't believe, that we should be getting involved when the British were fighting the French or whomever. Okay? We kind of made a mistake in 1812 and got involved, and we were lucky that wasn't a disaster. But we're going to follow this Monroe Doctrine for 150 years. Okay? We're going to try to prevent European interference in Latin America, and we're going to follow this third bullet here. Okay? We're not going to get involved until in a European war until World War I in 1917. So the Monroe Doctrine is a lasting landmark in American foreign policy. Now let's turn our attention to a specific area of the North American continent. As you may know, what we today call the state of Texas used to be owned by Mexico. And in the early 1820s, Mexico got their independence, but very few Mexicans lived in the northern part of their country in Texas. So the Mexican government made a fateful decision. They invited American settlers from Arkansas, Louisiana, and anywhere else to come live in Texas. And we took them up on that offer. Thousands of American settlers came to live in Texas. Now, over about a decade, the American settlers grew rather upset. Mexico was not a democracy, so the settlers in Texas had no say. Mexico didn't believe in slavery and told the settlers, don't bring slaves into Texas. The American settlers did so anyway. So by 1835, the Texans are going to revolt against Mexico. They're going to fight for their independence. And of course, the famous story from this Texas Revolution is what happened at the Alamo, the fort near San Antonio, Texas, where the handful of Americans were surrounded by the Mexican army and ultimately forced to surrender and were killed. Well, that wasn't the end of the story. At the Battle of San Jacinto here the following year, the Americans defeated the Mexican army and at gunpoint forced the Mexicans to sign a treaty declaring Texas independent. Now you might be saying, well, that's when Texas becomes part of the United States. That would be incorrect. Because Texas had slavery, the United States did not add Texas to the United States until 1845. So Texas was its own country for 9 years. Okay? Texas was its own country. Now, in addition, Mexico never recognized that Texas was independent. They still believed that Texas was part of Mexico. So, in 1845, when the United States finally grabs Texas as a new state, that's going to be the cause of the Mexican War, which we will start our next presentation with. So the story of Texas is unique in American history. And that story of Texas is impacted by the slavery issue, which is going on between North and South at the time. And finally, the President of the United States during the Texas Revolution was this man pictured here, Andrew Jackson, who was president from 1829 to 1837. And he was a very controversial president in American history. And you see a little outline here on the right of some things that he did during his presidency. You don't have to know all of them, just the ones that I mark and discuss. First of all, President Jackson moved hundreds of thousands of Native Americans from their land in the east across the Mississippi River to the Oklahoma Territory. Now, historians disagree on why he did this. Certainly it was to get the Native Americans' land so white settlers could have it. But some scholars also say he did it in order to save them, because the white settlers would have expanded continually and fought with the Native Americans and taken their land and perhaps eliminated them for good. But this was a tragic period in American history. Lots of Native Americans died on the Trail of Tears to the Oklahoma Territory. And, of course, our treatment of Native Americans in American history is a tragic one. Andrew Jackson is well known in the history books for his hatred of the National Bank, which had existed since George Washington's time. The National Bank was like the Federal Reserve is today. It's where the federal government keeps its money. And Andrew Jackson believed that the National Bank was an evil monopoly. So he took all of the government's money out and caused the National Bank to close. Now, this turned out to be a fairly bad idea, because without a national banking system for the next 70 years, the banking system in this country was kind of a mess. State banks were insecure, and many of them closed, and people lost their money, and this damaged our economy. So most people would argue that Jackson went too far when he shut down the National Bank. Jackson was the first president to really institute what's called the spoils system, from the saying "to the victor go the spoils." And what Jackson did was reward his political supporters with jobs in the government. Everyone who was of the other political party who worked for the government would be fired, and those jobs would be taken by supporters of Jackson who helped him get elected, even if those people were corrupt or unqualified for office. So this spoils system lasted for about a half a century, but unfortunately, during that half century, the federal government work suffered because there were people who weren't very qualified to do the work. Thankfully, that system was replaced by the civil service system that we have today, where federal government workers, for the most part, keep their jobs regardless of who the president is. And finally, President Jackson faced a major crisis in 1832 when the state of South Carolina refused to collect the tariff, the tax on foreign imports, because they said it was unconstitutional. And they argued if Jackson forced them to collect the tariff, then South Carolina would secede from the United States. They would leave the country. And this could have resulted in civil war, in the nullification crisis. To nullify a law means to refuse to follow it. Well, Jackson handled this nullification crisis brilliantly. He was very strong in telling South Carolina that nullification is illegal. It would break up the United States. We're going to force you to pay the tariff. But then at the same time, he worked for compromise in Congress to lower the tariff. And the compromise passed, and South Carolina accepted it, and the crisis was over. So many historians would argue that President Jackson was very successful in keeping the United States together and avoiding a civil war and making sure that no state could ignore national law. Finally, here are the 3 questions that I wish you to answer from this presentation. And notice the questions are demand perhaps a paragraph length answer for each. And you should answer these and, of course, send your responses as a Google Doc to the assignment on Google Classroom. Thank you very much for your attention.